Okay, welcome everyone to today's ICLRD webinar on marine spatial planning. Over the next hour or so, we will be focusing on the challenges and opportunities of marine spatial planning in the Irish context, particularly for local authorities. And it's really great to see so much interest as well in this topic. We've in total 4 presentations, and then we will have time for questions and answers as well at the end. So first of all, Mary McIntyre, the chair of ICLRD, I think will say a few words, welcoming everybody to the seminar from the ICLRD perspective.
Thank you, Cormac. Can everybody hear me, I hope? Yes, my name is Mary McIntyre and I am the current chair of ICLRD, which I'm not sure if everyone knows who ICLRD is, but it's the International Centre for Local and Regional Development, and you can find out more on our website if you haven't already visited it at iclrd.org. We are essentially a North-South US partnership founded in 2006, and our purpose is to explore and expand the contribution that spatial development and physical, economic, social infrastructure can make to peace and reconciliation in Ireland and elsewhere. And we do this through a variety of means: active research, capacity building, education, outreach. And this webinar is one of the activities, obviously, that contributes to all of that. We held a very successful series of webinars in 2021, and today kicks off the first in our 2022 series, and dealing with a very topical issue of the marine coast and the marine. Now, obviously, you don't need me to tell you that Ireland is an island, so the whole issue of the coastline and marine is really, really topical. And obviously, it's been brought into sharper focus recently with all the discussion around the need to move away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy, a large portion of which may well be offshore. Ireland is very conscious of all the issues around shipping, fisheries, mineral exploration, and of course the whole area of human activity and leisure and how that impacts in the area between the coast and the marine. So today, as Dr. Cormac Walsh has said, is a great opportunity to focus on the issues and on how local planning authorities can work together to address those. And clearly the marine doesn't the sea doesn't respect any boundaries, so it's an issue that transcends all jurisdictional physical boundaries. So very appropriate for ICLRD to do a webinar on this. These webinars are only possible through the generosity of all our contributors, and today we're very fortunate to have not just Dr. Cormac Walsh moderating this, but also Dr. Heather Ritchie from Ulster University. And our contributors include Sybil Bernard from McCabe Journey Barnes, Dr. Kofi Ansong from Ulster and from Howell Marine Consulting, and Ellen McMahon from the Sustainable Water Management Network. So very grateful to all our contributors and to our 2 moderators for facilitating this. And I look forward to us all having a very informative and inspirational afternoon. And as I say, this is the first in a series of webinars. And if you keep an eye on our website, iclrd.org, you will find how to register for the forthcoming series. So I'll pass back now to you, Cormac, to conduct this afternoon's session. Thank you. Oh, is it Heather? Sorry, Heather.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hi, everybody. Heather Ritchie here from Ulster. So yeah, with Cormac, I'm going to be helping to moderate this afternoon. And thanks, Mary, for those kind words. I guess just this afternoon, my main role is actually timekeeper. So I'm going to be pretty strict. Cormac has set a very strict time limit on everybody. So just for the speakers, I will jump in maybe at about 8 minutes just to let you know if you've got 2 minutes left further. And I'm also going to keep an eye on the Q and answer. So if anybody does have any questions, if you just pop them in the box, then we'll go through them and leave a little bit of time at the end to cover some of those. So I think we'll just kick things off. We've had a brief introduction to all the speakers, and they'll introduce themselves a little bit further and the topics of their papers. So with that, Cormac, if you want to start, and I'll start the clock. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Heather, for that. And thank you, Mary, for the introduction. Really what I want to cover to kick things off is an introduction to the marine planning context on the island of Ireland. I'm currently working as an independent researcher and consultant. I'm actually based in Hamburg in northern Germany, but involved in applied and policy work in Ireland as well on marine spatial planning and coastal management and a variety of other issues. So yeah, currently in the Republic of Ireland, it's, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it's a very dynamic context with the National Marine Planning Framework just published in July of last year and adopted by government. We have the Maritime Area Planning Act, which was finalized in December of last year with many implications for the development of the planning system and how it applies at sea as well. And much of this is steered by the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive from 2014, which required all member states to produce marine spatial plans by March of this year. Not all member states have adopted their final plans so far, but as far as I know, all member states with coastal waters, I should say, are in the process. And the European Commission is currently as well in the process of evaluating the plans that have been completed to assess the extent to which they align with European legislative requirements as well, which is a very important aspect of this. So in Northern Ireland, there is a draft marine plan. It's a draft since 2018. There has been a full consultation process as well, as far as I know. But of course, Heather and Kofi here are really the experts on the situation in Northern Ireland. And the Marine Act from 2013 is the key piece of legislation. Northern Ireland, of course, is no longer part of the EU process, but still very much linked into it because of the transboundary dimensions, which we will look at later on as well. So recently, I have conducted a critical evaluation of the National Marine Planning Framework, which was commissioned by SWAN through Ellen McMahon, who will speak next as well as part of this webinar. And this evaluation was published just this week, so it's very much hot off the press, if you like. The focus really was to assess the extent to which the NMPF aligns with EU environmental legislation. And what we found was that it provides a policy framework, but in some respects and in key respects, it's not really a spatial plan because it does not have a strong spatial dimension. It does not set out what will happen where and when over the period of the plan. So in that respect, there is no really clear vision of the public interest in the use and protection of Ireland's marine space. So there is a critical gap there at the moment, which will need to be filled with further plans at various scales. Another key aspect is that it does not implement an ecosystem-based approach, which is a key requirement from the European level. So it does provide provisions that this element will be included in decision-making, but the NMPF itself is not directly based on an ecosystem-based approach. Due to these and other concerns, we would argue that it risks becoming a development-led system, that some of the issues that have characterized the planning system on land in Ireland, that they may follow on at sea as well. And this is quite a serious issue because it influences the culture of decision making. So at the moment, there is a gap in strategic direction, if you like. And this means also that there is a role that can be played by local authorities and potentially regional authority assemblies as well to try and fill this gap in a sense, and to actively be part of the marine planning system, not just in terms of consent and at that level of individual projects, but at a wider, more strategic level as well. So first of all, it's important to ask, what do we actually need MSP, marine spatial planning, for? The focus, of course, in recent years has been very much on offshore wind, but other issues are certainly relevant as well, in relation to shipping routes, for example, commercial fishing and aquaculture, cultural heritage and tourism, just to name a few of the human activities at sea which need to be planned for, and where there may be tensions between different uses, and where there's a strong spatial planning dimension as well. On the other side, we also have environmental aspects which need to be given key active consideration. And Ellen will speak to some of these aspects as well in more detail. So marine spatial planning should really be connected to the process of developing a coherent network of marine protected areas, which is a key challenge for the Irish government over the next number of years as well, to increase the level of marine protected areas and to ensure that they are actually strictly protected also. Also to ensure that the impact of human activities at sea on vulnerable and valuable ecosystems is minimized. That's also a key requirement, and an aspect where close monitoring and data collection is really central to the process of ensuring that this is the case. There's also a strong element of actively restoring coastal and marine ecosystems, where marine spatial planning can play a strong role as well, and really needs to be part of this agenda. So if we look at the question of moving towards subnational marine spatial planning, what does this imply in the context of the Republic of Ireland? So we know from the existing legislation from December of last year that it allows for marine plans, designated maritime area plans, at subnational scales. But it does not make this a specific requirement. So a robust hierarchy of national, regional, local plans is actually currently missing. So this is an element where we will need to see how this develops in coming years, to what extent offshore wind farms will be developed outside of areas where there are DMAPs potentially, whether we have a fragmented approach to having marine plans for certain areas but not for others, and what the implications of that may be. This is a map that I produced sometime last year. It's a very rough map. Apologies for that as well. It's really just to give an indication of what a regional approach would look like if we had marine regions in Ireland. The idea here is extending the regional assembly boundaries from the land out to sea, that we could potentially have a marine plan focused on the Northwest Atlantic or the Celtic Sea region or the Irish Sea, recognizing that there are very different aspects which will need to be addressed in each of these contexts. And then further offshore, we also have areas that could have their own plans, probably from central government around the Porcupine bank or the Rockall Trough, for example. That would require a very, very different approach to other areas. And I think it's really essential that this regional differentiation is recognized, that the Porcupine Bank is very, very different in its characteristics and potential uses to the Irish Sea, for example. More locally, then, there are also options, and this is really where the potential role of local authorities may come in. There is an option for preparing DMAPs or local marine plans for nearshore areas, currently up to 3 nautical miles, but there is a possibility in the legislation for this to be extended as well. There is an interesting opportunity also to prepare joint DMAPs, for example, for the Galway Bay or Shannon Estuary. So this would be a local authority-led process of working together for functional regions at sea. Essentially, that's what we are talking about here. And there is really potential, I think, in this type of approach. Although issues of institutional arrangements and resources, etc., would need to be ironed out. There's also a potential for multi-stakeholder coastal partnerships following the UK model. This is something which has been explicitly addressed in the discussion so far on marine spatial planning in Ireland as well. And this would be a way to bring in further stakeholders. So there are potentials here for linking in processes of marine spatial planning to spatial planning on land. So there are opportunities there, but also challenges due to some of the deficits already mentioned. So I'm almost run out of time, I think, so I will leave it at that. The NMPF evaluation can be downloaded from the SWAN website, and there's a link here in these slides also. So thank you very much for your attention, and we can take questions then later on, but please do use the Q&A function as well to write any questions that you may have or comments. So our next speaker then will be Ellen McMahon from SWAN, who will talk about the environmental policy potential of marine spatial planning.
Okay, thanks, Cormac. That was great. Really, really fascinating. I wish we had a little bit more time to learn about that. I'll be downloading the report after this. So we'll pass on now to Ellen, if that's okay. And Ellen and I have got a lovely history whenever you were back up in the north on the Northern Ireland Marine Task Force. So are you good to go, Ellen?
I am. So you should be able to see my slides there now.
Yeah, brilliant. Whenever you're ready.
And thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this webinar today. My name is Ellen McMahon, and I'm the Policy Officer with the Sustainable Water Network. So we're a coalition of 25 environmental NGOs in Ireland. My own background is policy-based, and I've worked on marine protection and marine spatial planning for a number of years in New Zealand, Ireland, North and South. So the title of my talk today is Protecting and Restoring Coastal and Marine Ecosystems, MSP as a framework for action, and we'll aim to kind of address that question, I suppose, within this presentation. So the main focus of my presentation today is around coastal and marine protection. So I just wanted to kind of briefly set the scene as to where we're at with levels of protection in Ireland at present. So at the moment, we only have about 2% of our coastal and marine area designated as a protected area. And these are largely through the European directives, the Birds and Habitats directives. And that's where we get our special areas of conservation and our special protection areas. We were obligated to reach 10% by 2020, and that was through the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we have a new target now to reach 30% by 2030. And that's coming from the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and it's a commitment in the programme for government. So we have a huge challenge in front of us. And it's worth noting that that 2% is incredibly low, but actually the level of effective protection is lower again because we don't have specific management plans for a lot of those sites. So they're termed what we would call paper parks. So what we need is MPAs, and MPAs are a requirement of the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and that in my mind is probably one of the most important pieces or directives for our maritime area, in that it assesses the health of our seas. So member states make an assessment of how healthy our seas are based on a range of indicators, and then they set out measures to help achieve what's known as good environmental status. So between our SACs, our SPAs, and what we will have are these new designated sites. When we get our legislation for designating those additional sites, hopefully next year, they'll make up the network of coastal and marine protection in Ireland. So that's what we need, you know, in terms of protection. That's what we have, and that's where we need to get to. But where does MSP fit into this? So I've just pulled out the objectives of the MSP directive here, and please ignore the text heavy slide. But I've highlighted a couple of key points just for the purpose of today's talk. So the first objective talks about sustainable development, but crucially it says that member states need to apply an ecosystem-based approach when developing their marine plans. And that means that they need to be based on the best available scientific knowledge about the ecosystem, and that it should provide a really holistic perspective, apply the precautionary principle, and that it should be able to help evaluate the cumulative impacts of projects and activities. The second objective, again, talks about sustainable development in various sectors, which is really important. But in terms of that protection piece, it says that the plan should contribute to the preservation, protection, and improvement of the marine environment, including resilience to climate change impacts. So we have the recipe book here in MSP for protection and restoration of our marine and coastal ecosystems, and we know what we need in terms of healthy seas and our MPAs. And there's a line in Cormac's report that came out this week that says, you know, an expanded network of MPAs should be the backbone of an ecosystem-based approach to MSP, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And MPA should also be the backbone of that second objective, where they're to contribute to the protection and preservation of the environment. So how do these components then distill down into Ireland's Marine Spatial Plan, the National Marine Planning Framework? And is the NMPF in its current form an enabler for that protection and restoration? I would argue that in its current form, it's not there. There's major gaps in terms of spatial and temporal data on the current and future uses. And that's a crucial component when you're applying the ecosystem-based approach. We need that data. We need to know where we're going to put these activities so that we can make those assessments on what impact they're going to have on the environment. And without that data, or not having it in the plan, the ecosystem-based approach hasn't been applied, and that might compound the issues relating to protecting and restoring our marine and coastal ecosystems. There's no list of the features that we might require in a future MPA network. We have quite good knowledge and data on what needs to be protected and where it is. We're certainly not 100% of the way there, but we have a good basis for it, and that's not in the plan. So the protected area sites policy in the NMPF talks about avoiding areas and features that might be needed for protection. But if developers and authorities aren't aware of those features or where they're located, that undermines the protected sites policy. There is no sensitivity assessment, so these points are all interlinked. In order to have a sensitivity assessment, again, we need those features. And that sensitivity assessment will basically help to guide developments away from those vulnerable areas that we may need to protect and restore. So in practice, what this means is that under the current framework, we could have developments occurring in areas that we actually then realize we may need it to have protected or restored. And maybe quite an obvious point from what I've said above, but MPAs, so those outside of the SACs and SPAs, are not included in the final Marine Spatial Plan. And that's for a number of reasons. In Ireland at the moment, we don't have the legislation to designate MPAs, we've no definition, and that all needs to be set out in legislation. But the legislation that underpins the NMPF, the Maritime Planning Act, and that stemmed from the review of the Offshore Act a number of years ago. We were promised at that stage that those MPAs, those provisions would be in that act, and they're not there. I think at a minimum, what we would have liked to have seen in the act would be provisions for even those interim protections. So having that sensitivity mapping in place, and really have that pin up the Marine Spatial Plan, and that would have helped with that time lag that now exists, where we're going to see at least another year for legislation for MPAs, and then obviously the designation and putting management plans in place, that takes longer again. But in the interim, we're going to see a surge in developments, especially around offshore renewable energy. But what about designated maritime area plans? So this is an option I think that we have to our disposal when it comes to protecting and restoring our coastal ecosystems. So Cormac touched on them there, but the designated maritime area plans, they can be created now through the Maritime Area Planning Act. And these are going to act like, or can act like, subnational marine plans. And I think they can have a role to play in ecosystem protection and restoration, especially in this interim period that we now exist in. So the DMAPs, conservation is an activity under the Maritime Area Planning Act. So we have been told by the department that the DMAPs can be used for conservation purposes. We've also been told, however, that the first DMAPs are going to be for offshore renewable energy. So what I would like to do is, I suppose, test the role of DMAPs when it comes to conservation. We have a lot of the data at our disposal already, so why not have the first DMAP, for a conservation purpose? Or more importantly, why not have the DMAP to support the achievement of healthy seas and move us away from kind of a very sector-specific look on things to that more holistic ecosystem-based approach? Through the EU restoration law, we're going to have legally binding targets for restoration, and I think subnational marine spatial plans can help in achieving these targets.
2 minutes, Ellen?
Yep. So marine spatial planning, is it a framework for protecting and restoring our coastal marine ecosystems? Yes, it is. The methods for creating marine spatial plans and NPAs should be similar and complementary. And if we follow the recipe book, which is the Msp directive, and learn from best practice examples, Msp in Ireland can absolutely be a framework for protecting and restoring our coastal and marine ecosystems. Msp is the process, how we use our marine space and inform development decisions. And NPAs in those sensitive areas are one of the most common data layers in marine spatial planning. So where they might not exist, MSP should be able to help identify where they could be sited. And it's also worth saying, from a cross-border point of view, if we look at kind of aligning these processes, the marine spatial plans between Northern Ireland and the Republic, that could further protection and restoration efforts right across the shared waters around the island. So is it a framework and can it be used for this? Absolutely. But in Ireland, we're not just at that stage yet. So what do we need to do? In the first instance, all the future developments need to be guided by strict adherence to the precautionary principle, especially given the lack of data in the National Marine Planning Framework. The list of features for the MPA network need to be published. Developers, agencies need to know the proposed locations and the features that we may need. Then we need a robust sensitivity assessment, so that piece that will really underpin an ecosystem-based approach. The second offshore renewable energy development plan is underway, and there's going to be sensitivity mapping as part of that. So why not make it holistic and ecosystem-based, and help to kind of, I suppose, almost backfill that gap that exists in Ireland's marine spatial plan. And finally, the National Marine Planning Framework really needs to be reviewed and substantially updated if it's going to work for marine protection and restoration in Ireland. So that's me. And just to say that Cormac's report is now available on the SWAN website, swanireland.ie. It's a really fantastic report, and I recommend that you go and have a read of it. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ellen, so much for keeping to time. You were bang on, which was fantastic. So thank you for that. And a really fascinating presentation as well, and just the importance of having that ecosystem-based management approach. And actually the fact that we maybe could celebrate it in one of these new designated maritime area plans. So thank you for that. I'm going to move swiftly onwards to Sybil Bernard. So Sybil and I have worked together previously. Sybil was one of my first marine spatial planning master's students when we had our course up in Ulster. So a really proud graduate of Ulster that we have here today with us. And Sybil's done loads of really fantastic work in the consultancy McCabe Durney Barnes. So Sybil, I don't think you need much more of an introduction, so I will let you start your presentation.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, indeed, I think you said everything here. So hold on. Can you see? That's it. Sorry. There. Okay. Okay. So I've been asked kindly by Cormac to participate to the panel, and really what I'll be doing is discussing whether Msp is strategic. I'll be focusing on the Republic. I don't really have much experience in the north, so the focus will be on the Republic. So to be able to answer the question as to whether marine spatial planning is strategic, I think we need to have a very quick look at where we're coming from and where we are going. So as it has been said already by Cormac and Helen, we transposed the directive in 2016. This was followed in 2019 by the government's publication of the Marine Planning Policy Statement. The Marine Planning Policy Statement really showed where the government wanted to go and what they had in mind for the new marine planning system. This was followed in 2021 by the approval by Cabinet of the NMPF, and at the end of 2021 by the Maritime Area Planning Act. So last year really was a big year for the marine planning system in Ireland. We got a new plan and we got new legislation. At the moment, it might feel like nothing is happening, but actually the government is now looking at the marine management reform. So it's one thing to have new legislation. We need to see how the legislation works. So the government's now looking, how will the applications be made? How will information be shared? Who is going to be involved? And how all the elements are going to work together. At the end of the year, this will result in the official launch of the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority. So this new agency, state agency, will be in charge of maritime area consent. And also, Anbor Planola will become the competent authority for certain projects at sea, and that includes offshore renewable energy. So the diagram here is extracted from the Marine Planning Policy Statement, and it shows really what the planning system is going to look like. It's the planning trinity, as you can see. So we have forward planning, which consists of the NMPF, and that's the task of the Minister for Housing. And at the moment, the government is developing the development management system. So that's going to be split across a number of parties, including but not limited to MARA, Anbor Planola, and the coastal planning authorities. And it's also looking for the planning system to work. We need an enforcement system. So that is possibly going to be the role of MARA. So that's for the planning system and what's going to happen and what we've done so far. Well, as a nation, we have some objectives to achieve, and Helen has presented quite a few here, very important one. There's another one that the government is looking at, and I don't think it'll be a surprise for anyone. We're looking to shift the paradigm from being an energy consumer as a nation to being an energy producer. Why do we have to do that? Well, first, we have to decrease our reliance on fossil fuel and therefore on importing said fossil fuel. I think everybody will be aware there is an energy crisis. It's getting increasingly difficult to rely on other parties to provide us with our energy needs. There's another agenda, of course, that's ongoing, which is decarbonize electricity. We need to decarbonize our electricity production, and we need to meet our target toward climate change. Where is the focus? And of course, sorry, I forgot the final point. Ireland is a huge energy consumer. Ireland put themselves forward as the IT capital of Europe. There's a lot of data center, there's a lot of IT multinational, and energy consumption is skyrocketing. So really, we need to rebalance demand and supply. So, and how do we think that's going to happen? Well, it's going to happen in part, but very importantly, with the harnessing of marine renewable energy. So, how will we achieve that? Well, we're going to use the new marine planning system. Now it's being set up, so it has to be used for something. It's been mentioned by Ellen that the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan, the second iteration, was being undertaken at the moment. So this plan really looks like, in addition to identify mapping sensitivities, it also looks like at the potential quantum of energy that could be harnessed from certain parts of the Irish Marine Territory. Effectively, there is a strong possibility that this OREDP will become either the first designated maritime area plan or that it could become a key input to the first one. Because if the government is putting effort in preparing a plan, there's expectation it will have regard, and it's not just expectation, it will have regard to the National Marine Planning Framework, and they will somewhat work together because they are both not government policy. In addition, we are rolling out a new consenting system. And in doing that, we're effectively centralizing offshore renewable energy consent between MARA and onboard Planola. So to conclude, is Msp strategic? Well, I think I've answered partly that yes, of course it is strategic for the foreseeable future at least. It's the National Marine Plan. So yes, it is strategic, it's national, and it's also the only marine plan in place at the moment. There are pressing issues that go beyond the Irish remit. Really, this is a European challenge. We have to meet our own energy demand. So yes, it is strategic. I think it's a fair question to ask whether it could be a little bit too strategic. Perhaps it is a bit too strategic at the moment. It's a very complex. Marine spatial planning is very new, as very complex. So it's going to be really hard for Coastal Planning Authority to bring themselves up to speed, to get the staff, to get the experience that they will need to put forward designated maritime area plan. It's also going to be very challenging to reconcile the local level and the national level. In Ireland, the terrestrial planning system is three-tiered with the national, regional, and local levels. And at sea, we only have the national level, which, as Cormac pointed out so far, is not exactly very spatial. So it's going to be quite difficult to reconcile a very national plan with a very much lower level plan and see how they can work together. That's it. Thank you, Heather. I think I was within my 10 minutes.
Yes, Sybil, you were just over 7 minutes, which is fantastic. So that leaves us with even more time for questions at the end. And I should say, yeah, keep adding the questions into the Q&A, everybody. We really appreciate that. So again, Sybil, another really interesting presentation from you. I can't get my video on. So really like that presentation, and just talking about maybe it is a little bit too strategic. I think that's really, really interesting point, and some nice connecting view from what Cormac and Ellen have presented. So I'm sure we will discuss that a little bit later on. So thank you for that. I'll just introduce our next speaker is recently become Dr. Kofi Ansong, and I know that very well because I was his PhD supervisor. So delighted to have Kofi with us. So Kofi is now working as his PhD supervisor. So delighted to have Kofi with us. So Kofi is now working with Hoyle Marine Consulting. So Kofi, I will let you get started there if that's okay.
Sure, Heather. And thank you so much, Heather, for the introduction. So my name is Kofi Ansong. I'm a consultant at Hoyle Marine Consulting. And as Heather already introduced, I just completed my PhD, which was kind of looking at cross-border MSP on the island of Ireland, and specifically looking at contested areas and how the opportunities and I would say the challenges for actually implementing MSP in such areas. I think throughout the presentations, we've talked about the fact that the marine area is under threat and there's a lot of pressures under it. But I think what is critical to note is that when you look at the marine area and regions that are critically under threat, about 63% falls within cross-border and transboundary areas. And again, when you look at maritime boundaries, about 55% are also disputed or contested. And I think this raises a lot of issues. And the World Ocean Assessment 2, which came out in 2021, talks about the fact that in such areas where there are conflicts over jurisdictional boundaries, sustainability is always undermined. And I think it's critical that we address such issues and we look at cross-border areas. So that basically led me to looking at contested borders and also contested, specifically when you look at the island of Ireland, we're talking about Lough Foyle and also Carlingford Lough. And I think these are areas that we know quite well. And specifically the ownership of both logs have not been agreed yet. So this has led to a lot of management issues, specifically for Log 4. We know about the unlicensed oyster farming that is ongoing. Between the time space of 10 years, this has increased about 50% over time, and there has been a lot of environmental issues and impact, including the spread of diseases as well. When you look at Carlingford Loch, again, there's been a number of issues that's coming up in terms of transboundary consultation and how the process works. And there's already a case when you're looking at Warren Point Harbour and the marine license and planning permission that was given to the CO2 tanks that are at the Warren Point Harbour. Again, the issue there was that residents in Omead felt that they were not consulted when it came to the visual assessment, and rightly so, because the EIA directive actually talks about the fact that it needs to be environmental impact. So for visual impact, there wasn't any need for them to consult on that. But of course, this brought about a lot of issues in terms of how transboundary consultation should be structured for marine spatial planning. So moving on from there, in terms of how I structured my PhD research, what I did was to, first of all, look at the theory, and what I did was to conceptualize what integration means for cross-border MSP. So I came out with the dimensions for integration, which is looking at structural alignments, looking at community action and engagement, looking at the decision-making system, and also collaborative learning, also looking at leadership and how that can address kind of part-dependent issues, and also capacity to kind of enhance collaboration. What I did next was, in terms of my research methods, was doing document analysis. So as commented, Cormac has already presented, I also did a kind of an analysis of the existing marine spatial plans and legislation, also doing contextual analysis in terms of the socioeconomic, the history of the border and the conflict as well. Again, between March 2020 and March 2021, I also did 33 interviews, and this was with key stakeholders both in Northern Ireland and also in the Republic, just to discuss with them what are the challenges and opportunities for cross-border MSP on the island of Ireland. I also had a case study which was in the Pomeranian Bay between Germany and Poland, to kind of look at what has been the lessons learned for cross-border MSP that can inform what's happening here on the island of Ireland. So together, bringing all these cases together, I came out with some pathways that can inform an integrated cross-border marine spatial planning. So when we look at the context and what's happening on the island of Ireland, I think this has been presented a lot of time, but what is quite clear is the fact that the cross-border logs have not been considered in these plans. They've not been considered at all. And when you go into both of the plans, they already have transboundary policies in there. But I think these policies are quite vague in the sense that they kind of repeat already what's already in the EIA directive, in terms of if a project is going to have environmental impact, then there should be transboundary consultation. So it doesn't really add up to what is already existing, the existing legislation and directive that we have. Again, when you look at both plans, they note that the jurisdictional issues in Carlingford Loch and Loch 4 are still outstanding and unresolved. What the both plan doesn't do is to give an update about what's happening in terms of the negotiations between both governments. Again, when you look at how the mapping of sectors, I think most of the transboundary activities were not mapped out. I think apart from the Wild Atlantic Way and the Giant Causeway, which was shown together, especially in the NMPF, most of the transboundary activities were not mapped out as well. So just to quickly get on to what are the specific barriers that stakeholders talk to me about. I think one of the critical things that they mentioned was about the fact that the existing cross-border structures and institutions are quite ceremonial. And for example, I can give you an example of the Logs Agency, whereby they are prevented from actually kind of being in quotes, being an aquaculture licensing authority for both logs. And again, what stakeholders mentioned was about the fact that I think most of the time, the North-South implementation bodies are like a black box, whereby most of the discussions that happens there are not getting into the public domain. So there are issues of transparency and how you can get the public to get involved in such processes. Again, one of the issues that was raised, and I think this has already been discussed already, is the fact that, and especially with the NMPF, stakeholders felt that it was more industry and civil service driven. And by this, it was more led by offshore wind farm and also aquaculture. In terms of community action and engagement, I think a lot of them mentioned about the fact that they felt the consultation, the MSP consultation documents were quite intangible and complex for them to give a proper response to it as well. So moving on, I think what local authorities kind of mentioned, and a number of them mentioned this, is about the fact that there is limited capacity for them to carry out the MSP remits under the MAP Act. And I think that's quite critical in terms of talking about regional MSP. Within the Northern Ireland Marine Plan, one of the issues that was raised is that there was limited social and economic evidence to kind of back a lot of the policies that were proposed under the draft plan. Again, although there's been a lot done on MSP, stakeholders felt that there is still limited appreciation and awareness about what it is and what it can actually do. I think overall, the feeling was that there's a lack of political leadership and direction when it comes to what should be the cross-border priorities, especially with both cross-border locks, and what should be the role of local authorities in terms of giving them a bit of direction about what they should be doing when it comes to marine spatial planning. So overall, I kind of brought together about 5 of these pathways in terms of discussing what should be the way forward in terms of the role of local authorities. And I think one of the critical issues here is about transparency. And I think it's critical that both governments update the public on what is happening when it comes to the ownership negotiation and the management agreement for aquaculture. Again, other countries have found ways of addressing these contested issues through joint development zones and also transboundary peace parks. So these could be alternatives that can be explored in terms of addressing these issues. When it comes to community engagement, I think it's critical that comprehensive summary documented infographics are developed to kind of get community stakeholders to get involved a bit more in the marine spatial planning process. We've already talked about coastal partnership, but I think what is key and critical over there is funding. And I think there is a need for direct funding from DERA and DHLGH to kind of support such process. Again, when you are talking about areas such as the cross-border locks, there's a need for the role of the locks agency. And I think this is a discussion that should be carried forward. When it comes to the regional MSP, I think there is the need to establish what's the link between the NMP, NIMP, and also the NMPF. There's a need to establish that link. And I think one of the ways to do that is through the MSP map viewers. If there was a way of connecting the two to make sure that you can switch on and off the layers from neighboring plans to kind of understand what's happening at a transboundary level, and also the projects that are also coming up. I think with the local authorities, what's coming up is resourcing, and I think there is the need for staffing, and there's also the need for training courses on MSP. I think one of the lessons that I picked up from the Pomeranian Bay case was about the fact that a lot of the staff have been there for a long time, about 10 years. And I think reflecting on that, on what's happening on the island of Ireland, is the constant change in civil servants. And I think that doesn't help a lot when it comes to cross-border ties. So it's something that needs to be discussed. And when it comes to cross-border platforms, I think the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership and also the East Border regions can be platforms to kind of have open dialogue and discussions when it comes to the implementation of the regional MSP. And I think this will sum up some of the thoughts that I have in terms of how local authorities can be involved in the regional MSP. Again, I have a paper out with Heather, which discuss a lot of these issues that I've already raised, which is in marine policy. So if you want to find out more information, kindly go and check that out. And I hope, Heather, I'm already in time.
You are, Kofi, fantastically in time. And thanks for the plug on our paper. Go and download it for us. Thank you so much, Kofi. That was really, really interesting. And Cormac, if it's okay, what I could maybe do while people are still putting in some questions to the Q&A is just do a quick roundup of some of the key points that I have maybe got from people's papers. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we just touch on your paper first, I've been sitting scribbling away in the background. So I think some of the key things that were coming out of your presentation, Kofi, was just, Cormac, of the initial idea that the NPF is not It's not really a plan as maybe us planners would maybe see it as a real spatial plan. It's more of a policy framework. We need to have those additional spatial planning dimensions within the plan of what is going to happen and where. And I think we've definitely seen this with the Northern Irish draft marine plan as well, those similar discussions about, is it a strategic plan or is it just really a representation of what's currently happening on the ground? And I think the 3 points that you made then really about that critical gap of we need more than, maybe there will be sectoral plans that come after this, and that it doesn't really currently as it stands implement that ecosystem-based approach. And maybe this will come into play when we start seeing some of those applications coming in. The risk with that, I guess, is what you said as well, is that developer-led system. And again, we need to figure out, what's going to happen at those consenting stages. And then just towards the end of your presentation, it was really lovely to see that idea of, how can we start thinking about sub-regional marine plans, those more local level. And then also you mentioned about extending the regional boundaries as well, which was really interesting. And again, something I would like to look into a little bit more. We then moved on to Ellen's presentation, and again, she had highlighted some of the major, what she sees as some of the major gaps on the plan currently, more specifically on the gaps on data and the real need for much more data, particularly on the current and the future uses on that. And if we can get that data, then we will be moving towards that idea of having more of an ecosystem-based approach applied. But she said the real danger with this is the time lag, and it's always this idea of the time lag of how long it takes for legislation to be created, and then the designation of the MPAs after then. And she highlighted at the start, we have a massive target to reach of 30% of a coherent network by 2030, which is huge. So I think that was really useful from Ellen's presentation. Then we move on to Sybil's presentation, and what Sybil did so nicely, which is something I will need to show our students when I'm teaching them about marine spatial planning next year, is actually a lot of this can be aligned to what we know as the planning trinity when we're thinking about terrestrial planning. So Sybil really neatly presented in one of those slides about the marine planning policy statement. And if we think about the three sort of strands of the planning trinity, the development plan itself, development management, and enforcement as well, and who is in charge of each one of those. So we'll have for the plan, obviously as DHLGH, for the development management, the applications coming through for consent is going to be Amber Planola, and then for the enforcement, some aspects of MARA as well. So I think that was really good to hear that, and just to set it in those terrestrial planning terms that more people might be aligned with knowing. The second half of Sybil's presentation was really interesting in terms of actually thinking, well, what do we need to do? This massive idea of Ireland as the IT capital for data centers, I just hadn't realized how massive that was in terms of the energy consumption and everything that's happening around as well in terms of, our energy crisis, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and really turning Ireland from a consumer into a producer. So that was really good to hear those types of arguments coming through from Sybil. And then finally, just on to Kofi. And I think Kofi's presentation really adds just this idea of the contested cross-border issues that we really haven't dealt with properly, I think for both North and South for obvious reasons. But I think this pinch point of the cross-border locks is so important, and that when you actually start looking into the plans, the policies are incredibly vague in that they say they have done transboundary consultation, but it maybe just is consultation. It's not actually working together with the stakeholders and those local community groups as well. So a lot of the boundary issues are still very much unsolved, and probably who knows when those issues are going to be dealt with. I think some of Kofi's key findings are really interesting about the kind of ceremonial nature of those cross-border structures and institutions that we have in place. And again, those issues of transparency as well. The coastal communities coming late to the party and often maybe not quite understanding what marine spatial planning is and how it could actually affect them as well. And again, some of the the findings and new ideas that Kofi was coming up with towards the end of his PhD again is about some ideas of transboundary peace parks. That's something that's happened out in China and the Far East, and those are some nice ideas that we could maybe build upon. And one of the very sort of local and sort of very practical issues is a change of staff is always happening on the ground, and that can affect the sort of longevity of the knowledge base around marine spatial planning. So Cormac, that's just some of the suggestions that I had sort of scribbled down, and maybe we can jointly turn to some of the questions.
Yes, thank you for that, Heather. That's a really helpful summary of the discussion so far. I should say myself that I've learned a lot from listening to the different presentations as well. And so I hope they have been relevant and interesting for our audience also. Yeah, within the Q&A, there have been quite a number of really interesting questions as well, going into the detail of some of these critical issues that we are discussing here. I would like to pass on to Ellen, first of all. Maybe she would like to respond to some of the questions that are raised here from Conor Crowther and Richard Collins in relation to the management of MPAs and yeah, what's going to happen with the development of MPAs to 2030.
Yeah, thanks, Cormac. And yeah, some really great questions in there. I'll just touch on the one from Conor there first. And it's about targets for effective management. So the short answer is that we should be managing 100% of our protected areas effectively. That's it in short. So first and foremost, we need the objectives for each site, and then you determine management plans based on those objectives, and that's effectively managing them. The actual, you can break management down then into various components. You can have kind of very active measures for managing, where you might go in and do like some active restoration in a site, like reseeding native oyster reef, something like that. Or you can have passive, where you might close either the entire area or specific areas. So that's I suppose the short answer to that question. And there was another one here from Richard, who was talking about, I suppose, the danger that the push for MPAs will look like a win in itself, and that there's a risk of, I suppose, incoherence or thinking of the UK experience and kind of not getting as far as a true ecosystem-based approach. I agree completely. I suppose in some ways, especially in the South, we can learn, I suppose, from best practices examples and look at legislation elsewhere as we're developing ours to try and avoid those pitfalls that we have seen in places like the UK, where bottom trawling is still occurring in many of the protected areas, likewise in Ireland in a lot of our SACs. So I think getting the legislation right down here is a golden opportunity. And what we would want to see in the legislation, and it's now something the UK is kind of, I suppose, looking back on and saying, well, at the time they wanted it in legislation, it didn't get over the line, but it's the whole site approach. So it's where you manage the site in its entirety, not just looking at one specific feature or habitat. And Richard, you also mentioned there about enforcement and resources. Absolutely. I'm saying we need 100% of these MPAs to be managed effectively. A key component of that management and the success of these sites is that the management plans and measures are enforced. And for that, we need adequate resources. And to date in Ireland, many of our state agencies have been critically under-resourced. So that's vital as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Ellen. I think one of the first questions that came up was really interesting, and it was addressed for Cormac, was from Conor Crowther, who said, how do you think a robust hierarchy of national, regional and local plans can be realised? Do you think that this would best be achieved through an independent marine planning authority or through existing local and regional authorities? So Cormac, do you want to just follow up on that?
Sure, yeah. This is a really key question here. And it's, I mean, of course, about resources and about a range of other key fundamental issues. I would say that, yeah, really local authorities and possibly also regional assemblies should have a strong role here. I I think it's important to recognize that marine spatial planning should be a democratic process. It is really important there is engagement with coastal communities. In fact, Sybil's research from a number of years ago in Spatial has really demonstrated the need for intensive community engagement. And this is a very strong rationale. This provides a very strong rationale for having local authority involvement in MSP, and it's not being a centralized process. It can't just be about technical, scientific evidence-based management. That is not sufficient on its own. We are dealing with contested issues with different uses about how to balance protection, ecosystem restoration, with emerging and traditional uses of sea space as well. These are issues which relate to different values held within society. There needs to be a local role also. So in that sense, yeah, I would certainly think this should be a process where there is local authority involvement, but we really need to recognize that that means proper resourcing and training for local authority staff as well. And this is a process that cannot be done overnight, that this will take some time also.
Okay, thanks for that, Cormac. So we've got another question, which is for Kofi from Richard Collins. So Richard asks, to Kofi, I wonder whether the resolution of the boundary disputes, e.g. in Carlingford and Foyle, would aid in effective transboundary MSP, marine protection or other joint initiatives. Flipping that around, does the unresolved nature of the boundary also offer an opportunity in pushing towards joint development or other transboundary initiatives?
Yes, just to respond, I think the simple answer over there is yes, definitely. I definitely agree that it helps. And I think that's what ecosystem-based approach is all about. It's just about planning beyond boundaries. And if you're thinking about even MPAs, are we trying to protect species and habitats in the north as against the south? And are they aligned in a way? So I think going beyond what the border is, the boundary, kind of brings in that kind of ecosystem-based approach whereby you can have and I think that's what the locks agency was about, kind of have an authority that kind of manages the locks from as a unique ecosystem without having the border over there. So I think there's a big opportunity there, especially when we're thinking about developing a regional plan. And that could be a way of actually having something that covers the logs. So I hope this would be an opportunity for the local authorities when they are thinking about their regional plans to kind of consider how do we bring in some of these areas to have a plan that covers it. Again, there are already sensitivities about such areas. So I think what is critical is just also direction from government about what should be the way forward or what should be the direction that should be taken, being it local authorities or being it the locks agency or any of the cross-border institutions. So I think there's definitely a big opportunity here to have something that is more integrative, I think.
Super. And just while you're on, Kofi, and it's maybe linked to this, another one just from Conor Crother there, it says, in addition to the locks agency, do you think that the experience of cross-border organisations like the Commissioner of Irish Lights, who I know you spoke to in Waterways Ireland, could be harnessed to help address the cross-border issues you've identified?
Yes, I think so. But I think their experience comes a bit more at a project or operational level, where they have a lot of experience when it comes to addressing, should I say, these project level challenges. And definitely they do have experiences that they can share when it comes to cross-border engagement and how that can be undertaken. And in my reference to the locks agency, it was not only about the locks agency, but I think a number of these cross-border institutions have experiences to share to guide any approach towards having a cross-border MSP. Yeah.
Super. Just another question for Cormac, if that's okay, from Christina Kelly. So Christina asks, is there a risk of increasing fragmentation by using the designated marine area plans for specific marine activities like offshore renewables?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question as well. And it's really about this issue of should we take a sectoral approach or a spatial approach to marine policy and marine spatial planning? Really, I think, we need to do both, but there needs to be very close integration. And the real advantage of marine spatial planning is that it is spatial. And spatial means that it is, in essence, cross-sectoral. It is about how different activities relate to each other. So I do really see that that is a problem if DMAPs, subnational marine spatial plans, will be primarily sectoral. To my mind, it would make far more sense if they were regional and really focusing on how different activities and different claims to marine space interact with each other within a specific geographical context. This is really a very important issue, I think. And this is part of what the ecosystem-based approach is about, that we do look at these issues in an integrated manner. And my concern would be that this will be very difficult with a sectoral approach where this integration will not be at the forefront, at least, of implementation. I would like to also come back to the issue of cross-border cooperation and cross-border institutions. And I think here it's really important to recognize that ICLRD has been involved often behind the scenes in cross-border cooperation and spatial planning, in providing this space for interaction between planners north and south, and looking at very specific issues in both the Northwest and Newry Dundalk as well. So there is a legacy to build on there. Just recently, ICLRD has been part of a process of preparing the groundwork for a new, what will hopefully be a new spatial strategy for the Northwest city region, focused on Derry and Letterkenny. And I mean, of course, there is potential here as well to include coastal and marine issues within this type of informal spatial strategy as well for cross-border areas. So this is maybe one potential avenue to look at into the future in more detail, where these issues could be addressed outside of but complementing the formal planning system in each jurisdiction.
Super. Can I just bring Sybil in quickly, just to ask a really quick final question of Sybil, just to pick up on one of the points you made, Sybil, about reconciling that kind of national interest with the more sort of local level plans at that regional sea level. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of years?
Well, I think, Heather, we can see already at the moment there is an ongoing cycle of county development plan being prepared, and they all recognize the new national marine national marine planning framework. The thing is, at this point in time, they've recognized a policy that has not really been implemented. So what's going to happen on the ground, I think it remains to be seen. That being said, I do believe that all of the local authorities would be supportive of, offshore endeavors, whatever they may be, as long as they comply with policy and they abide by all the environmental parameters. There is a lot to gain for locally, and particularly in rural areas, from, having, say, new technology and therefore new companies, new opportunities for funding. So I think they will be supportive. How it's going to work in practice, I think it'll be an interesting challenge nonetheless. Look forward to seeing it.
Well, thank you so much, Sybil. I think we'll stop on the questions there because we don't want to run out of time. But if anybody hasn't had their question answered directly on this, maybe you can get in touch with the speaker directly and continue those conversations offline. Cormac, should we just hand over to Mary quickly for just some final remarks before we completely close the session?
Sure, sounds good. Yeah.
Are you still there, Mary? Maybe Mary's gone, Cormac.
Yeah, otherwise, I think really at this stage, it's for us to say thank you to the panelists,
yeah,
and for everyone in the audience as well, and for the questions that you posed. I would really like to see as this as the beginning of a conversation, really. And I think, you know, we really do need to monitor what is happening in coastal and marine planning, and really to see how this is develops as an ongoing process in both jurisdictions. So it'll be really interesting to see how much of this pans out. Currently, as we have seen, the legislation, the policy frameworks, they allow for a lot of different things to happen in different ways, but comparatively little is fixed or set in stone. And anyone who's knowledge of the Irish planning system knows that this can be a problem. So yeah, we will really need to keep a close eye on how things develop. And I think it's really important in this that we keep the conversation going in relation to the links between planning on land and planning at sea, and also thinking critically about how the different dimensions of strategic forward planning link to local management, consent processes and enforcement on the ground as well, and how the spatial planning process is linked to environmental policy and planning issues as well. So there are a number of key points of interaction there in the system. It is very much an ongoing process. So yeah, let's see how this continues, and let's keep the conversation going. So yeah, and finally, of course, thank you to Heather for doing a really great job in chairing this and really keeping
with my digital watch, Cormac. And
wow.
I just have to mention one quick thing, or else Caroline will be really cross. This is the first of this kind of season's ICLRD webinars. So the next webinar is on the 15th of June, and there'll be more details to follow that in due course. So thanks, Cormac, and thanks everybody, and thanks for your questions too. Thank you.